When an actor became the hero in real life and killed a man, true crime documentary. Hook. What happens when an actor's role turns into a deadly reality? A twisted true crime story of fame, power, and a shocking crime you won't believe. Stay tuned till the end to uncover the chilling truth that no one saw coming. When he opened his eyes again, everything was blurry. His chest felt heavy, like he was being smothered. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. Panic set in. Was he dead? No. He could feel the cold concrete beneath him. He could hear the distant hum of traffic outside. But something wasn't right. The silence was too deep. His head throbbed. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through his side. His fingers brushed the wetness on his skin. Blood. He winced, forcing himself to focus. Where was he? The room was different now. It was small, claustrophobic. Dim light filtered in through a cracked window. His hands were tied. Tight. He tugged. But the ropes only cut into his wrists. He had to think. Had to get out. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps nearby. They were slow, deliberate. He knew that sound. The sound of someone stalking their prey. His pulse raced. He needed to act fast. He scanned the room. There was nothing to use as a weapon. No knife. No tools. Just the walls closing in on him. The footsteps stopped. Right outside the door. His breath caught in his throat. The door creaked open. He tensed, waiting. A figure stepped into the room. The man who had been tied to the chair. But this time, he wasn't the one in distress. The fear in his eyes was gone, replaced by something darker, something familiar. "Did you really think you could play the hero?" the man asked, his voice cold. The words hit like a punch to the gut. The man stepped closer, his footsteps echoing. "I was always the villain, wasn't I?" He couldn't speak. His mind raced, trying to piece it together. The truth felt out of reach. He had to get out of here, had to survive. But everything around him felt like a trap. And the man, Eli, was getting closer. Eli's smile was twisted, cruel. He took another step forward. The air felt colder, like the temperature in the room had dropped. The walls seemed to close in tighter with each passing second. He struggled against the ropes, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "You never understood, did you?" Eli said, his voice low. "You thought this was just a role to play, didn't you?" He tried to speak, but his throat felt dry. His mouth tasted of blood. Eli's laugh echoed in the small room, harsh and grating. "You were just a puppet. A pretty face for the cameras." The words stung. He'd been the hero for so long. But now he was the victim. Eli leaned down, his face just inches away. The coldness in his eyes burned through him. "You're not the first to fall for it," Eli whispered. He was losing control. His thoughts scattered like shattered glass. The floor beneath him seemed to tilt. Everything felt so unreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. The man he thought was the victim had become the one in charge, the villain, and now there was no escape. Eli stood up, pacing the small room. He murmured to himself, almost like a chant. The words were incoherent, maddening. His hands trembled, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had to get out. But the ropes were tight, and Eli's presence was suffocating. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, crushing him from all sides. "Do you know why you're here?" Eli asked suddenly, his voice sharp. He didn't answer. Eli didn't wait. He grabbed the edge of the chair, lifting it with ease. "I'm not the villain. You are," he spat. And before he could even comprehend what was happening, Eli swung the chair, smashing it against the wall. The sound of breaking wood filled the room. Eli stood over him, grinning, a glint of madness in his eyes. "You're the one who played with fire, hero," Eli sneered. "You thought you could save everyone. But now, who's going to save you?" And just like that, the door slammed shut, leaving him in darkness. The darkness was thick. It pressed in from all sides, like a weight on his chest. He could hear his heartbeat, loud in his ears. Each thud echoed in the silence, mocking him. The ropes bit deeper into his skin. His hands were raw, aching, but he couldn't stop. He had to get free, had to escape. The sound of his breathing was the only thing that filled the room now. Every inhale felt like it might be his last. He shifted in his chair, trying to find any weakness in the knots. His fingers scraped against the rough cord, the burning sensation intensifying. His mind raced. What was Eli planning? Was this just some sick game? Was there more to this than he could understand? And then a creak, a sound from the corner of the room. He froze, holding his breath. The darkness seemed to grow heavier. Another creak, a slow drag of footsteps. Eli was still here, still watching. He couldn't see him, but he felt his presence. It was suffocating, like a dark cloud hanging over him. He tugged harder at the ropes, desperation mounting. The sound of Eli's footsteps grew closer, closer, and then, suddenly, the door swung open again. A sliver of light cut through the room, harsh and bright. He squinted, unable to see clearly. The outline of a figure appeared in the doorway. Eli stood there, a smirk on his face, still trying to break free. The words dripped with mockery. He tried to speak, but his voice was weak, barely audible. Eli didn't care. He stepped into the room, leaning close. "Time's up." Before he could react, Eli moved swiftly. The air shifted as something cold pressed against his throat. A blade. Sharp. The sharpness of it sent a chill down his spine. He froze, terror coursing through him. One wrong move, and it would all be over. Eli's breath was hot against his ear. "You thought you could be the hero, but you never were." The knife moved closer, the tip grazing his skin. He could feel the pressure build. His heartbeat quickened. Sweat dripped down his face. Eli was toying with him. He could feel the tension, the slow buildup. And then, just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the knife was pulled away. He gasped for air, struggling to regain control. Eli stepped back, laughing softly. "You're still not getting it." And with a final cruel smile, he turned, walking out of the room, leaving him alone again. Tied. Trapped, the door slammed shut behind him. The sound reverberated in the small, cramped room. Silence. He couldn't move, couldn't think. His breath was ragged, shallow. The pain in his side flared with each shallow inhale. He was still alive, but for how much longer? His mind raced, searching for a way out. But all he saw were the shadows, the darkness that had swallowed him whole. The ropes were cutting into his wrists, but he didn't dare stop pulling at them. Every movement, every shift of his body felt like it could be his last. He strained against the restraints, blood pounding in his temples. The room felt like it was closing in again, the walls pressing tighter, suffocating him. Was this the end? He couldn't allow it to be. Not yet. Not when he still had breath left in his lungs. His fingers were slick with sweat, his palms raw and bleeding. But he couldn't give up. Not now. With a final, desperate jerk, he tore the ropes free. The sudden release sent a jolt of pain through his arms, but he didn't care. He was free. For a moment, he just sat there, gasping for air. His mind scrambled to piece together what had happened. What Eli had said. Was it true? Had he really been nothing more than a puppet? He couldn't afford to dwell on it. He had to escape. Had to get out of this nightmare. The door was still ajar. A sliver of light cut through the darkness, like a beacon of hope. He staggered to his feet, pain shooting through his body with every step. But he couldn't stop. He had to get to that door. The hallway was just as silent as before. The shadows seemed to stretch and writhe around him. He glanced back over his shoulder, but there was nothing. Nothing but the emptiness that had consumed him. He took one shaky step forward, then another, and another. Each step felt like an eternity. The door at the end of the hall seemed miles away. He pushed forward, ignoring the pain in his body, ignoring the fear gnawing at his insides. And just as he reached the door, he heard it, a faint sound, a whisper. "Running won't save you." His heart stopped. He turned around, but there was no one there. The voice echoed in his mind, haunting him. He didn't have time to process it. He had to leave. Now, with one last burst of strength, he pushed through the door. Stumbling into the night, the door slammed shut behind him. The sound reverberated in the small, cramped room. Silence. He couldn't move, couldn't think. His breath was ragged, shallow. The pain in his side flared with each shallow inhale. He was still alive, but for how much longer? His mind raced, searching for a way out. But all he saw were the shadows, the darkness that had swallowed him whole. The ropes were cutting into his wrists, but he didn't dare stop pulling at them. Every movement, every shift of his body felt like it could be his last. He strained against the restraints, blood pounding in his temples. The room felt like it was closing in again, the walls pressing tighter, suffocating him. Was this the end? He couldn't allow it to be. Not yet. Not when he still had breath left in his lungs. His fingers were slick with sweat, his palms raw and bleeding. But he couldn't give up. Not now. With a final, desperate jerk, he tore the ropes free. The sudden release sent a jolt of pain through his arms, but he didn't care. He was free. For a moment, he just sat there, gasping for air. His mind scrambled to piece together what had happened. What Eli had said. Was it true? Had he really been nothing more than a puppet? He couldn't afford to dwell on it. He had to escape. Had to get out of this nightmare. The door was still ajar. A sliver of light cut through the darkness, like a beacon of hope. He staggered to his feet, pain shooting through his body with every step. But he couldn't stop. He had to get to that door. The hallway was just as silent as before. The shadows seemed to stretch and writhe around him. He glanced back over his shoulder, but there was nothing. Nothing but the emptiness that had consumed him. He took one shaky step forward, then another, and another. Each step felt like an eternity. The door at the end of the hall seemed miles away. He pushed forward, ignoring the pain in his body, ignoring the fear gnawing at his insides. And just as he reached the door, he heard it, a faint sound, a whisper. "Running won't save you." His heart stopped. He turned around, but there was no one there. The voice echoed in his mind, haunting him. He didn't have time to process it. He had to leave. Now, with one last burst of strength, he pushed through the door. Stumbling into the night, the cold night air hit him like a slap to the face. It was sharp, biting, but it cleared his mind. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. The city sprawled before him, quiet, eerie. The streetlights cast long shadows, stretching across the empty pavement. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Every fiber of his being screamed to run, to escape, to get as far away as possible. But the fear gnawed at him. There was something more, something he hadn't yet understood. His legs were shaky, unsteady beneath him. The pain in his side flared, but he ignored it, pushing through. He couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until he knew he was safe. He took a few more steps, then another. His mind raced. What was Eli's game? What did he mean when he said, "running won't save you"? Was Eli still watching him? The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. His heart pounded harder. It was like he could feel Eli's eyes on him, even from a distance. A chill ran down his spine, but he refused to look over his shoulder. Not yet. His phone. He needed his phone. He fumbled for it in his pocket, hands slick with sweat and blood. The screen lit up in his hands. He dialed the number. His thumb hovered over the screen, but he hesitated. Would anyone believe him? Would anyone help him? The line rang. Then click. Hello. It was his agent. He almost didn't know what to say. He almost couldn't breathe. Get out of there. Now, he managed to say, his voice trembling. What's going on? Are you okay? The panic in his voice didn't sound like his own. I don't know. Something's wrong. Something's... The phone cut out. The screen turned black. His heart skipped. No signal. No signal? He tried again. Nothing. The hairs on his neck stood up once more. Something wasn't right. Then a noise. A distant sound. A car engine. It was growing louder. Closer. He spun around, but all he saw was the long, empty street. The car approached faster. Faster. His heart slammed against his ribcage. A black sedan screeched to a halt in front of him. The window rolled down. He couldn't see the driver's face, but he felt it. That same chill from before. I thought you were smarter than that. Eli's voice came from the shadows. His voice was colder than the night itself. And just like that, he knew. There was no escape. The streets twisted and turned, each corner feeling like a dead end. His legs burned, his chest tight from the strain. But he couldn't slow down, couldn't stop. He pushed forward, his feet pounding against the pavement, his breath ragged. The streetlight he'd seen earlier was still ahead, but it felt miles away. Every step brought him closer to exhaustion, but he refused to let it pull him under. Behind him, Eli's footsteps never stopped. The sound of them was constant, like a heartbeat echoing in his ears. He dared not look back. He couldn't afford to. A shadow shifted ahead. He stumbled, nearly losing his balance. But it was too late. Eli was there, right in front of him. The gap was closing fast. He could feel it. The breath caught in his throat, and his heart thundered against his chest. "You're not getting away," Eli said, his voice calm, but with a dark, deadly undertone. The words sent a chill down his spine. Panic rose, threatening to consume him. He had to act, had to do something. He turned sharply to his left, diving into a narrow alleyway. The walls pressed in, the air stale and heavy. It was too tight, too confined, but it was all he had. He could hear Eli's footsteps growing fainter, the distance between them expanding, just enough for him to catch his breath. The alley twisted into darkness. No windows, no exits. He was trapped. He whipped around, desperate for an escape, but the alley ended abruptly. A brick wall, a dead end. He felt the ground shift beneath him. He was cornered. His heart raced. Eli's laughter echoed from the mouth of the alley. It was cold, sickening. The sound of it crawled under his skin, making his muscles tighten in fear. He had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. "Don't worry," Eli said, his voice coming closer now. "You'll be just fine. You've already done your part. The hero has to die eventually." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He felt the weight of them, like a cold truth that wrapped around his throat, squeezing until he couldn't breathe. He wanted to scream. He wanted to fight, but his body wouldn't cooperate. His legs wobbled. His vision blurred. Eli's figure came into view, dark and looming, his silhouette blocking the light. A shape, no, a shadow. He took one last, ragged breath. And in that moment, he realized he had no more fight left in him. Eli was right. He had always been just another player in a story that was never his own. The hero was never meant to survive. The darkness was absolute. It felt like drowning, like slipping beneath the surface, unable to grasp for air. For a moment, there was nothing. No pain, no fear, just emptiness. But then, slowly, the world began to creep back in. His eyes fluttered open, the harsh light of the streetlights above blinding him. He could hear the faint sound of traffic in the distance, the occasional passing car, but it all felt so distant. His chest heaved with shallow breaths, the pain in his side still lingering like a dull throb. His hands were sticky with blood, his fingers trembling as he pressed them to the wound. He wasn't dead, not yet, but it felt like he was being torn apart from the inside. He tried to push himself up, but the world swam around him, spinning, dizzy. His body refused to cooperate. Eli's laughter echoed in the back of his mind. That laugh, the way it sounded like victory, it twisted his insides, made the nausea rise in his throat. But he couldn't give up. Not now. Not when it felt like his very life was slipping through his fingers. He managed to roll onto his side, his hand scraping against the rough concrete. Everything was blurred, but through the haze he could see it. A shadow. A figure. Not Eli. Someone else. Someone was moving towards him. Quick, purposeful steps cutting through the stillness of the night. A voice. Hey. It was distant at first, but it grew louder. Are you okay? The figure stopped beside him, a hand reaching out. He flinched at first, instinctively recoiling from the touch. But then, the hand rested gently on his shoulder. Hang on. I'm calling an ambulance. His vision blurred again, but he could make out the shape of a person above him. A woman, her face a blur of concern and panic. The faintest sense of relief began to stir within him, like a flicker of hope in the darkness. But then, that voice came again, the one that had haunted him, the voice of Eli. Don't bother. Eli's voice whispered from the shadows, cold and final. You're too late. The woman froze. He felt the world tilt. His eyes struggled to stay open, the darkness threatening to pull him under once again. But before he could say anything, before he could warn her, everything went black. And this time, he wasn't sure if he would wake up. The darkness wrapped around him like a thick, suffocating blanket. He couldn't tell how much time had passed. Minutes? Hours? Everything was numb, like his body no longer belonged to him. The sound of distant sirens echoed somewhere in the haze, but they felt like they belonged to someone else, someone far away. His thoughts drifted aimless, and then a flicker of light. At first, it was just a blur, but as the world slowly started to come into focus, he could make out the shape of a ceiling, a harsh fluorescent light above him. He blinked, struggling to clear the fog in his head. He was in a hospital. He felt cold, wrapped in a sterile blanket. His side burned, but it wasn't as intense as it had been. The pain was still there, though. Sharp, real. And then a voice. Hey, take it easy. He turned his head, seeing a figure standing in the doorway. A nurse. Her face was kind, concerned. You're safe now, she said softly. You're in the hospital. Do you remember what happened? He opened his mouth to respond, but his throat felt dry, like sandpaper. He coughed weakly. He couldn't speak. Eli's face flashed in his mind. The blood, the knife, the alley. He fought to stay awake, but the weight of everything that had happened was too much. His eyelids grew heavy, closing against his will. The nurse's voice faded, a distant sound, like a ringing in his ears. And then a shift, a sudden coldness in the room. The air seemed to change, the atmosphere thickening. He tried to open his eyes, but it was too late. The shadows had returned, and the chilling, familiar voice broke through the quiet. You're not getting away, Eli. His breath hitched, his body jolting in panic. He tried to sit up, but his limbs wouldn't cooperate. Get away from me, he wanted to scream, but the words didn't come. The figure in the doorway blurred, and he could see nothing but the darkness surrounding him. Eli, he whispered hoarsely, but it sounded wrong, like someone else was speaking. The figure stepped closer, and the coldness filled the room, suffocating him. The door creaked open, and he saw a shadow in the hallway. His heartbeat thundered in his chest. Was this real, or was he still trapped in that nightmare? His hands trembled, reaching for the side of the bed. He needed to escape, but as the figure stepped into the room, the light flickered once, then went out entirely, and in the pitch blackness, all he could hear was that low, mocking laugh. It was all coming back. The game, the fight, and Eli always Eli. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The silence in the room grew suffocating. He could feel it, the presence, the weight of it, pressing in from all sides. His heart raced, hammering in his chest. The darkness felt alive, swirling around him. He tried to move, to get up, but his limbs were heavy, unresponsive. The bed beneath him felt like quicksand, pulling him deeper into the abyss. And then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing in the pitch black. Each step was like a countdown, drawing closer. He wanted to scream, to call for help, but his throat was raw, the words stuck, trapped in his chest. The room felt colder now. Impossible. He had been safe. He had been in the hospital, but nothing made sense anymore. The footsteps came closer, closer still, and then the voice. Did you really think you were safe? It was Eli, but not just Eli. It was the echo of him, a phantom in the dark, twisting his words, mocking him. You're never safe, the voice whispered, cold and low. It was too much. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The walls of the room seemed to close in tighter. He reached for the edge of the bed again, desperately, but his hand grasped at empty air. His body was locked in place, immobile. There was no escape. He had to get away, had to find a way out. But the darkness only deepened, wrapping around him, suffocating him with every passing second. And then the flicker of light, a single, dim bulb overhead buzzed to life, casting a weak, flickering glow across the room. For a moment he could see the bed, the walls, but there was something else, a figure standing in the corner of the room, a shadow. It wasn't Eli. It was someone else, someone taller, someone watching him. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silently observing, its presence oppressive. His breath caught in his throat. He knew that figure. He couldn't mistake it. It was the last thing he had expected to see. And then a whisper, a voice, familiar. I'm sorry. It was soft, almost sorrowful. The words felt like a punch to his chest. His body shuddered. The figure stepped forward, into the light, revealing a face that made his heart stop. It wasn't Eli. It was someone from his past, someone he never thought he would see again. His mind raced, trying to process, to understand. But the figure's next words shattered everything. I couldn't stop him, the figure whispered, almost apologetically. Eli's always been in control. And just like that, the ground beneath him seemed to give way. All hope, all sanity. Slipping into the abyss. Once more, the figure's words hung in the air like a death sentence. He couldn't breathe. His chest felt hollow, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him, suffocating him. Eli, he whispered, his voice weak, cracking. The figure's face was still familiar, but twisted by something dark, something unforgiving. The person stepped closer, their features now illuminated by the flickering light above. It was a face he had once trusted, a face he had once called a friend. But now it was a stranger. Why? His voice barely escaped him. Why did you let him? The figure's eyes were cold, distant. I didn't have a choice, the person said quietly, their hands trembling slightly. You don't understand. He's been controlling everything. You, me, everyone. You were just part of the game. A cold shiver ran down his spine. The game. It was all coming back. Each twisted step, each false move. Eli had never been the end. He was just the beginning. The pieces were all falling into place now, but it was too late. I tried to warn you, the figure continued, their voice shaky. But Eli, he's unstoppable. If you'd stayed away, if you'd just left. No, He shot up in bed, his body screaming in protest, but he didn't care. He needed answers. What the hell are you talking about? Who is Eli? The figure hesitated, glancing around the room nervously, like the walls themselves might have ears. You never really knew, the figure muttered, their voice dropping to a whisper. Eli's not just a man. He's a force. Something far more dangerous than you can imagine. He's been planning this for years, pulling the strings, making sure that everyone follows his script. His head spun. The words didn't make sense. Asterisk, he was the hero. He was supposed to be the hero asterisk. But now he was nothing but another pawn in Eli's game. The figure stepped closer, their hand trembling as they reached for him. "Get away from me!" he screamed, pushing them back, but his body was weak, and his movements felt like they were made of lead. "No, you don't understand," the figure said urgently, their eyes wide with panic. "There's no way out. He will find you again. He's always watching, always controlling." The door behind them slammed open with a force that rattled the walls. He turned just in time to see a shadowy figure step into the room. Eli. His face was cold, his eyes empty, and that smile that could freeze blood in its tracks. "You should have known better than to run," Eli said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "It's always been part of the plan." The figure beside him stiffened, fear evident in their posture. Eli's eyes flicked to them briefly, a sneer forming at the corner of his lips. "I did warn you," Eli said softly, almost like a father chastising a child. "But some people never learn." The room seemed to darken again, the lights flickering violently as if on the brink of shutting off. He could feel the air grow heavier, more oppressive with each passing second. Eli took a step forward, his shadow swallowing the light. "I gave you a chance," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But now you're part of the story. Forever." His heart pounded in his chest as Eli's figure loomed closer, filling the space with an oppressive, suffocating darkness. No more escape, no more hope. He realized then, with gut-wrenching clarity, that the game had never been about winning. It had always been about survival. And in the end, survival was never guaranteed. The darkness seemed to swallow everything whole, pressing down on him like a heavy weight. Eli's presence was like a shadow cast over his soul, cold and unrelenting. He tried to move, to fight, but his body refused to cooperate. It felt like he was drowning in the very air. Eli's eyes gleamed in the dim light, calculating, patient. "You still think you can escape?" Eli's voice was a low growl, his words slithering through the room. He wanted to scream, wanted to run, but it was like his mind was caught in a fog. Every step Eli took felt like it was closing the gap between him and the edge of something terrible. The figure in the corner, his former friend, stood frozen, their face pale, eyes wide in terror. They knew better than anyone that there was no escape. "Please," the figure whispered, their voice breaking. "You don't have to do this." Eli's smile twisted, cruel and cold. "Don't worry," he said, his voice laced with malice. "I always finish what I start." The figure flinched, stepping back slightly, but Eli's eyes never left them. "You were always weak," Eli spat, his words sharp, venomous. "And now you're nothing but part of the story, a forgotten chapter, a failed attempt." The figure's knees buckled, their body crumpling to the ground as if the weight of Eli's words had crushed them. For a brief moment, the air grew still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then everything seemed to snap. The lights overhead flickered once more, casting shadows across the room, elongating them, twisting them into monstrous shapes. Eli's gaze turned back to him, dark and hungry. "There's no more running," Eli whispered, stepping closer, his breath cold against his skin. "No more hiding. You were never the hero. You were always just the pawn in my game." The words hit him like a physical blow. He wanted to fight back, to shout, to break free, but everything inside him felt like it was collapsing. He could feel the icy grip of dread closing around his throat. Eli reached out, his hand brushing against his arm, the touch sending a chill through his body. "You'll never be free of this," Eli murmured, his voice soft now, almost soothing. "You belong to the story now." And then, without warning, Eli stepped back, his figure melting into the shadows like smoke, disappearing from view. The room was silent once again. He looked around, confused, disoriented. His heart pounded, each beat louder than the last. Was it over? Had he survived? But even as the silence grew, he knew the answer. It wasn't over. Eli's presence was still there, lurking just beyond the edges of his consciousness. And in that moment, he realized, no matter how hard he fought, no matter how far he ran, he would never escape. The game would never end, because Eli was always watching, always waiting. The silence in the room was deafening, but it was not peaceful. It was oppressive, like the calm before a storm. He could still feel Eli's presence lingering, an invisible weight in the air that refused to leave him. His chest heaved with shallow breaths, every inhale a struggle, every exhale a release of tension that never quite reached his soul. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, to prove that Eli had gone. But the room was still, empty. His hands trembled as he gripped the bed frame, fighting the urge to collapse into the void of his own mind. It couldn't be over. He refused to believe it. The sound of his heartbeat filled his ears, thumping louder, faster, until it became all he could hear. Suddenly, the door slammed open again, breaking the silence like a thunderclap. He jerked back, his heart skipping a beat. But it wasn't Eli who entered this time. It was someone else. A doctor, his face tight with urgency, his steps quick and measured. "You need to stay calm," the doctor said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of tension. Stay calm. He could barely breathe, let alone stay calm. But the doctor wasn't listening. He was already moving toward the door, his gaze scanning the hallway outside, as if searching for something or someone. "Where's Eli?" he blurted out, his voice hoarse, cracked. The doctor froze. The expression on his face shifted, just slightly, like he had been caught off guard. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to the bed, his hand hovering near the foredrip. "We're moving you to another room," the doctor said quickly, his movements swift. But there was something in his eyes, something dark and knowing. And in that moment he understood. The walls were closing in again. It wasn't over. He wasn't safe. Not here. Not anywhere. Before he could say another word, 2 orderlies rushed in, their hands grabbing him gently but firmly, guiding him out of the bed. His body was weak, but he could feel the panic rise once more, the tightening in his chest as they moved him down the hall. His eyes scanned every corner, every shadow, searching for the one thing he feared most. Eli. But it was the doctor's face that haunted him now, that flicker of recognition in his eyes that told him everything he needed to know. The doctor wasn't just a doctor. He was part of it, part of the plan, part of the game. As they wheeled him through the sterile, white corridors, he realized something more horrifying than anything he'd faced so far. He would never escape. Eli was everywhere. And this place, this hospital, was just another stage in the game he could never leave. The orderlies stopped in front of a door. The room was small, isolated. No windows, no exit. The doctor gave him a look, one that said it all, before he turned and walked away, disappearing down the hallway. The door shut with a soft click, and then silence again. But this silence was different. This silence was waiting. It was only a matter of time before the next part of the story began, and there would be no happy ending. The silence in the room felt heavy, like a thick fog pressing in from all sides. His heart pounded in his chest, louder now. the beats almost deafening in the oppressive stillness. He stood there at the center of the small, windowless room, his body trembling, aching with exhaustion. But there was something else, an unbearable sense of dread gnawing at the back of his mind. It was coming. He could feel it in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. The door clicked behind him, locking him inside. The sound was final. He wasn't leaving this room. Not again. He sank down onto the cold floor, his hands pressing into the stone tiles as if to steady himself, but it did nothing to calm the panic rising in his chest. He needed to think, to find a way out. But the truth crashed down on him in waves. There was no way out. Eli was everywhere. The walls, the floors, the very air he breathed. It was all part of the plan, part of the game. The realization hit him like a blow to the stomach. He wasn't a player. He was the prize, the pawn in a twisted story written by someone else. He looked around the room again, his gaze darting over the blank walls, the flickering light above, the door that sealed him in. There was nothing here but shadows and empty space. And then the shadows moved. He froze. A figure stepped out from the corner, emerging from the darkness like a ghost, a cold smile on its lips. Eli. He had been here the whole time, watching, waiting. "How did you?" he began, but his voice was barely a whisper. Eli chuckled, the sound sharp, mocking. "You still don't get it, do you?" Eli's voice was smooth, almost affectionate, but the malice was clear beneath. "You were never meant to escape. This has always been your fate." His body trembled as Eli stepped closer, his presence suffocating, overwhelming. There was no escape, no hero, no victory, just the game, and it would never end. Not for him. Not for anyone. Eli raised a hand, his fingers hovering just inches from his face. "You're mine now," he whispered, his voice a dark promise. And with that, the room plunged into darkness once again. This time, there would be no waking up. The darkness consumed him entirely. It wasn't like before. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was a presence, a weight, a finality. He tried to move, tried to scream, but his body felt heavy, like it was buried beneath miles of earth. His thoughts grew slow, muddled by the suffocating silence. But then, a single voice broke through the stillness. It wasn't Eli's. It wasn't the doctor's. It was his own. He felt it, deep within his chest, a small flicker of defiance. No matter how much the darkness pressed in, no matter how hopeless it seemed, there was still something inside him that refused to surrender. He would not be part of Eli's game. Not anymore. The world around him shifted. It wasn't like the chaos of before, the twisted, suffocating horror that had driven him to the edge. This felt different. He could feel the air change, a rush of cold that sliced through the suffocating warmth of the darkness. A crack of light, a door opening just a sliver. And through that crack, he saw something. A vision, a fleeting moment of clarity. He wasn't trapped here forever. He was stronger than Eli had thought, stronger than the game. The walls began to tremble, the silence finally breaking apart. The flicker of light grew brighter, more defined. He wasn't powerless anymore. He moved slowly at first, but then with more confidence, his limbs free from the weight of fear. It was the final push, the moment of truth. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on the crack in the darkness. And then freedom. It wasn't a dramatic burst of light or a loud explosion. It was just the quiet realization that he could choose his own fate. He wasn't the hero in the story, but he didn't need to be. In the end, it was enough to simply walk away. With a final, steady breath, he stepped through the crack, leaving the game and Eli behind. And for the first time, he allowed himself to truly be free.